Socialist Equality group in New Zealand and a writer for the World Socialist website. I will be one of the moderators for this event alongside Eric London, who is also a writer for the WSWS and a member of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, who's written extensively on the crisis that is currently enveloping American politics. Eric will be elaborating today on some of his analysis of the unfolding coup attempt by US President Donald Trump. We're very pleased to be joined by the Socialist Equality Party's presidential candidate, Joseph Kishore. Joseph joined the SEP in 1999, and he has written hundreds of articles and pieces of analysis for the World Socialist website. He's been the national secretary of the party since 2008. We're also joined by Santa Cruz, our candidate for vice president. Narissa joined the SEP in 2013, and she has written extensively, particularly about the issues facing young people and facing immigrants in the United States. 2 weeks ago, we broadcast a discussion with Joe and Narissa entitled "The Civil War Election," and that was not an overstatement. The Trump administration is actively stoking fascism. It's defending the far-right gunman, Kyle Rittenhouse, and others. It's threatening to disregard the result of the election and overturn it through the courts and with the support of armed thugs and militias. Our analysis presented in that meeting has been confirmed in spades over the past 2 weeks, particularly following the presidential debate in which Trump again promised to ignore the vote and told his fascist followers in the Proud Boys to, quote, stand by for action to help him remain in power. Today's meeting is entitled "The Sickness in the White House," which of course refers to the outbreak of COVID-19 centered around the president himself. But not only to that, we are analyzing in real time what is the terminal sickness of American democracy and the very immediate threat of a coup d'etat, which faces the American working class. This is an election like no other in American history. The working class faces great dangers, both in the United States and internationally. That will be very clear from this discussion, as well as the need for a socialist response by the working class and by young people to this threat. To those listening today, I encourage you strongly to participate in this discussion. You can submit questions and comments on our Slido account. If you visit slido.com, slido.com, and just enter the code Socialism 2020, Socialism 2020. Or you can also comment below this video wherever you are watching it and leave your questions in the comments. I would like to now introduce Joseph, first of all, to begin our discussion. Joseph, perhaps you would like to begin with an overview of Donald Trump's contraction of coronavirus and perhaps explain why he has made this decision to return to the White House while he's clearly still infectious. I mean, what is the purpose of that? And perhaps you can talk about some of the wider political issues here. Thank you.
Sure, and thank you, Tom, and greetings to everyone watching this meeting in the United States and throughout the world. As Tom said, this is an election which really is unlike any in American history. I think that many workers and young people throughout the world are asking the question, what is happening in the United States? And hopefully we, in the course of this meeting, will begin to answer that question. We are now just over 3 weeks until the election. And it's quite clear that the really unparalleled political crisis in the United States is escalating. As you noted, the title of this meeting, when we announced it earlier in this week, was "The Sickness in the White House," and we were referring to, of course, the fact that Trump had contracted coronavirus, the product itself of the whole policy of the White House, and not just Trump, but a whole layer of top White House officials, top military officials have come down with the coronavirus. And we were going to develop the theme and explain the significance of this in relationship to the sickness, not just in the White House, but in American capitalism. And of course, events have developed even since the announcement, and in particular, the announcement or the revelation of the far advanced plans in the state of Michigan by fascist groups, fascist individuals, to seize the governor of the state, try her, and execute the governor, Whitmer. And this will be a central focus of tonight's meeting. But perhaps to answer your question and place that in its broader political context, I would just note the sort of framework within which the World Socialist website and the Socialist Equality Party have been analyzing these developments. We published a statement now just about under 2 weeks ago in the aftermath of the debate between Trump and Biden, in which we analyzed the political strategy of Trump, which was revealed very clearly in the debate itself. This was the debate where Trump said of the far-right supporters that they should stand back and stand by an open appeal for the preparation of far-right violence, and again threatened that he would not accept the results of the election. And we, in that perspective, drew out what was Trump's strategy. And we said the strategy is very clear. First, we said the strategy is motivated by the phrase, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. And we said that the strategy had four basic components. First, it was before the election to create as much disorder, violence, stoking of far-right groups, claiming that the whole process was rigged, and creating as much violence and turmoil in advance of the election as possible. And second, we said that on election day itself, Trump would declare that the results, however they went, were well, I would say that that if the results didn't go against them, that they were invalid. He would capitalize on the fact that mail-in ballots were delayed and declare himself the victor. And then we said third, he was calculating that in the aftermath of the election, he could utilize the Supreme Court to challenge any results that went against him and rubber stamp his efforts to stay in power. And of course, that's connected to the ongoing attempts to ram through the nomination of Trump's Supreme Court pick, which begin this week. And we said the fourth element of that strategy was his reliance on the fact that the Democratic Party would really say nothing, that it would do nothing to expose before the American people the reality of what was happening and what Trump was doing. Now, so in the aftermath of the debate, Trump's contraction of the coronavirus had intervened. He was forced for a couple days to go to the Walter Reed Medical Center and seek treatment, but then left Walter Reed and returned to the White House very quickly. And we published a statement on October 7th in which we explained why this was necessary. And we said, above all, it was driven by the fact that Trump's ongoing conspiracies in relationship to the election could not be carried out from a hospital bed at Walter Reed Medical Center. He had to go back to the White House. And then it did not take very long for us to see really what concretely we were talking about. only 2 days later, after Trump's return, was the announcement of the foiled coup in Michigan, the arrest of 13 individuals who had planned, as I said, to kidnap and murder the governor of the state. And as I said, we now know somewhat more concretely what we were in fact talking about. And we'll discuss the significance of these developments in this meeting, and Eric will review some of the details of the plot and its broader framework. But this was not an isolated incident. We're talking about a network of far-right fascistic organizations with ties to the state that have been deliberately promoted, incited by dominant factions or significant factions within the state apparatus, including the Trump administration itself. And then in terms of our analysis of the political dynamic in the United States, when we said that Trump was relying on the silence of the Democratic Party, on its fear of saying anything about what is really happening, for the fear of stoking broad-based popular opposition, that too has been confirmed. Only really within hours or days of the announcement of this coup, it has completely dropped off of the coverage in the media. The leading Democratic Party politicians, including Biden and Harris, have made no major statement about this coup. And it's in line, again, with how they have responded to the whole conspiratorial activity of the Trump administration. They are very worried about, as it's saying, anything that will alert the population to the dangers that it confronts and stoke broader popular hostility, not only to the Trump administration, but the whole policy of the ruling class. We are entering the final stages of this election under conditions not only of a massive political crisis, but an unprecedented social, economic crisis, mass unemployment, massive poverty, of course, the expanding pandemic itself, which has already killed over 220,000 people in the United States. It is an extremely explosive economic, social, and political situation, and that is what the ruling class is responding to.
Thank you, Joseph. I mean, I wonder now, perhaps, Eric, you might be able to explain a bit more about this, the specifics of this plot in Michigan. I believe you wrote a perspective on Saturday for the World Socialist website about this silence, in particular focusing on the silence of the Democratic Party. And as Joe was explaining, it really is quite incredible that they have done everything to downplay this. The New York Times is not focusing their coverage on this, and other media outlets are largely silent. So I wonder if you could comment on that, but also, especially for international listeners and listeners who are not familiar with this, all the details of this plot. Could you explain to us what the facts of the case as they currently are known?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Well, first thing that has to be said, and I'll support the points that Joe has made already, but the first thing that has to be said is that the events of the last 4 days make absolutely clear what Trump has in mind when he refers to his refusal to accept a peaceful transformation of power. And anybody in the corporate media or the political establishment or in their orbits in the pseudo left who tells you that that there's a question of what Trump is planning, that is not in question anymore. That's not in doubt anymore. He has made this abundantly clear. Now we'll see what takes place. We're not here to make predictions, but what the 15-page complaint that was filed by the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Michigan makes clear is that this was not a bunch of amateurs. This was very highly coordinated. Many states involving a substantial amount of money and preparation to kidnap an elected governor and essentially kill her, take her across the lake to the state of Wisconsin, and kill her, and God knows what else they had in store. And I think that it would be a mistake to underemphasize the importance of the danger which this poses. The emphasis which we have placed on the World Socialist website has been as well on the number of unanswered questions which come up in the course of this. The Attorney General of Michigan, Dana Nessel, made the comment, which we have referenced on MSNBC, in which she said, "This may very well be the tip of the iceberg. I don't feel as though our work or the work of the federal authorities is complete, and I think there are still dangerous individuals out there." Now, that only makes the silence of the corporate media and of the Democratic Party all the more criminal, and it makes them themselves complicit in the crime, which, at least on its face, was directed against one of their own governors. But ultimately, of course, this fascist violence is directed against the working class, and that's why we are undertaking our effort to expose this. And we hope that those honest journalists and professionals who are present and workers who are listening will join us in this endeavor. I would just add, and by the way, the most rotten role has been played by the New York Times and the Washington Post. I mean, this story has essentially disappeared from the front pages. It's also clear that the majority of the plotters who are out there are at liberty. That includes the greatest conspirator of all, who's sitting in the White House, and his aides. And we will maybe in the course of this meeting have the chance to go over some of the individuals who should be investigated for their potential role in this conspiracy. But again, it is clear that this is not an isolated incident. It's the statements that the state officials themselves are making. There are a number of reports which have come out from various police agencies, which make clear that the rise of these militia groups in a very politically directed way, encouraged by the president himself, who, as you mentioned, Tom, said that they should stand by. That's a military order, by the way. That was not just something that he came up with off the top of his head at the time. So for us as socialists, I mean, what we really seek to uncover. Oh, and I'll just actually make one point in addition. Biden spoke today, Biden spoke yesterday in Pennsylvania, and he made some statement in which he suggested there would be trouble on election day, and so sensitive is the ruling class to the prospect, as Joe said, that even referencing in the press the immense dangers posed by the threat of this essentially fascist insurrection in Michigan to take over the state capitol, to bomb the state capitol, to decapitate the leadership of the state, is all the more remarkable. And Biden said he walked back. This is what shows that they're very sensitive. Biden actually was forced to take back what he said about trouble on election day. And he said that voters, quote, should not pay attention to Trump's threats to influence and scare people from voters. Well, we, of course, pay very close attention to this. We're seeking to expose these dangers. We're seeking to expose the complicity of the Democratic Party in this. And I think that the dynamic that Joe raises about the role that the Democrats have played is very important because the Democratic Party, and it's valuable also to compare the fecklessness of the Democratic Party on the question of the threat to assassinate a governor of the 10th largest state, the silence on this question, and the absolute ferocity on the issue of Russia, for example. For the last 5 years, the New York Times and the Post and CNN are all screaming about how they think that Russia stole the election by buying $100,000 worth of Facebook ads, if that's even true. And it's all what the intelligence agencies say. There's never actually any factual proof. Well, here you have proof. They arrested 13 people. They carried out raids in cities across the state of Michigan. We know that there are, just based on the complaint, groups in Wisconsin and Ohio who are involved in this. These are all the states upon which the outcome of this election are going to be determined. And under these circumstances, the media treats this like just a normal part of the news cycle, and the Democratic Party covers it up. And this is part of the dynamic that I think is very important, especially for those workers who are listening, to recognize that there is no other organization other than the self-organization of the working class, leading behind it those young people and elements in the middle class who are opposed to dictatorship, which can and will stop this coup from taking place.
Thank you, Eric. And I guess I'd like to bring Narissa into the discussion as well. Perhaps you could expand on this. I mean, it really is extraordinary what both Eric and Joseph have raised, that in the face of this clear terrorist plot against a democratic governor, the response is to play it down in this way, and to urge people to basically go about their business as usual. I believe we summed it up on the World Socialist website as move along. There's nothing really to see here. I mean, that's the Biden campaign's response to every provocation by Donald Trump, including this Michigan plot. But I wonder if perhaps Narissa or Joseph could expand on this point a bit. I mean, yeah. Why is this happening? Well, we're often told, I suppose, not just in the US, but internationally, that really, much as we don't like the Democratic Party, they are the alternative to Trump, and the fact that Trump represents such a danger, such a massive threat to democratic rights in the United States shows that you have got to get behind the Biden campaign. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Well, I mean, first, I think what has to be explained is that the response, this fecklessness that Eric and Joe have laid out, is really the response of what are class interests that are driving the actions of the Democratic Party, who, as we've said, have, this story has, essentially been completely wiped off of, the major, the mainstream media. There has been no calls by the Democratic Party for any sort of mass protests to prevent, this threatened coup, these, or really any questions into the degree of these conspiracies. I think the fact that, Whitmer herself said, this is just the tip of the iceberg and it's happening to other governors. There's been no call for the subpoenaing of, high profile officials with ties to the White House who have, ties to these right-wing extremist groups, from, Eric Prince, to Betsy DeVos, who, herself, had ties to the protests, the April protests in Lansing, where, armed right-wing extremists, were openly threatening, had, entered into, the Capitol building with, AR-15s. The response by the Democratic Party has been, for Trump's entire time in office for the last 3.5 years, has been to actively suppress any opposition at all. And Biden's response has been to Trump saying that he will not leave office peacefully, has been that this is nothing but hot air. Really actively downplaying it. I think it's important too to mention what Harris said during this past Tuesday's vice presidential debate, when asked directly what the Democratic Party would do if Trump did not leave peacefully, she, essentially went around the question and said, well, I began listing off the high profile ties of the Democrats who have support in the military and state intelligence agencies, listing off the Bush administration kind of war criminals and cronies who would support, and essentially calling in the military to assist with the removal of Trump from office. So I think it's important for our listeners and viewers to understand what is being put forward in this election. You have, on the one hand, this unconstitutional, illegal threat of a coup and power grab, either by, with the assistance of the Supreme Court, of right-wing extremist groups, showing up at polling places, intimidating voters, the use of Republican-controlled state legislatures, this denial, this refusal to leave office by the Trump administration. And then what is the response by the Democrats is that, well, we'll call in the military, we'll call in state intelligence. But what is entirely left out of the equation is the working class. Hundreds of millions of people are casting their votes right now, who will show up at the polls. I mean, what they're being told is that really that doesn't matter. Regardless of the votes, what is going on, what we're seeing right now, the political crisis represents, bitter factional struggles within the bourgeoisie who are going to work to, determine the election. And this has actually been the response by the ruling elite since the stolen election of 2000 and the ruling by Scalia that essentially laid out that the population is denied any right to suffrage to choose the presidency. So as Eric was saying, the response by the Democrats to the Trump administration has never been to sort of raise the alarm about the threat of dictatorship, but has always been about these backdoor issues over foreign policy, which is, really what their concern is. They speak for, the Democratic Party speaks for, sections of the financial oligarchy, for the affluent sections of the upper middle class and state intelligence and military brass, who are fearful of, essentially the response that an attempted, coup by the Trump administration would have. So as we've tried to lay out what the Democrats fear a revolutionary social upheaval as a response to the threat of a Trump dictatorship, more than they fear a Trump dictatorship.
Thank you for that, Narissa. We do have a number of questions coming in, which I would like to get to, but Narissa mentioned our analysis of the 2000 stolen election. And I just wanted to remind our viewers that there was a discussion of that at the previous online event, which you can find on the World Socialist website on the YouTube channel. And I highly recommend all of our viewers to watch that discussion as well, because those lessons that Narissa referred to are extremely pertinent, and the analysis that our movement made of that stolen election has truly been confirmed. That was really a major turning point in the breakdown of American democracy, where the Democratic Party allowed George Bush to to steal the election. Because as Narissa pointed out, their greatest fear was opposition in the working class, not the Republican Party. So just a couple of questions then, and perhaps Joe might like to address these from a couple of different people, but they're related questions. Tom asks, how can we organize effectively in anticipation of the November 3rd chaos? There's a related question, if there's a coup in the USA, what do we do to resist that? And then I think this is also related. Is Black Lives Matter an effective platform on which to oppose Trump and the militias? So those are all, questions that go to the heart of what does the response of the working class need to be in this crisis leading up to the election?
Well, I think that the critical question for workers and young people is to intervene into this political crisis with their own program and perspective, to not allow the conflict within the state, and there is a conflict which is raging behind the scenes within the state apparatus, to not allow it to be confined within the apparatus of the ruling class and the different factional interests within the ruling elite. That is a recipe for disaster, whatever happens on November 3rd and in the aftermath. The working class has to intervene with its own program on the basis of its own interests in response to the coup attempts of Trump and what is connected to that, the ongoing catastrophe of the pandemic and the massive social crisis, which is engulfed the United States. The Socialist Equality Party has called for the formation of independent working class organizations, a network of rank and file neighborhood committees to unite and organize common struggle against the whole policy of the ruling elites, to prepare for the development of a general strike movement. And I think the logic of objective developments is in that direction, a general strike movement which would demand the removal of Trump as part of a political offensive against the whole capitalist system. I think, however, that the fundamental question or the fundamental foundation for such a movement is a real political understanding of what is happening. What are the social forces which are expressed not only in the policy of Trump, but also the response of the Democratic Party. And Eric and Narissa have spoken about this, and we've often written about the fecklessness, the cowardice of the Democratic Party. However, that should be sort of conditioned, because when it comes to representing the interests of the ruling class against the working class, the Democratic Party is very, very determined to block, to suppress the opposition of the working class, to channel it behind the factional conflicts within the ruling elite. And everything they do is dictated by that class necessity. The Democratic Party is a party of Wall Street, of dominant sections of the military and the intelligence agencies. When Narissa referred to what Harris said, and she was asked, what will you do if Trump refuses to transfer power? And then she said, well, we have the support of Republicans. We have, many people in the George W. Bush administration. We have 500 generals. In other words, she's saying that is the social constituency that we are basing ourselves on, political constituency. And if there is a conflict, that is the constituency that we will rely on. And if the military doesn't intervene to, in some way or another, organize a transfer of power, they will do nothing. And above all, they're terrified of mobilizing popular opposition. What Eric referred to, because Biden had said, it's one of these incidents which reveals sort of, political reality. He had said, the only way that I can lose is if there's chicanery happening at the election. That is, if Trump tries to mess things up, he tries to, organize, he was referring to, the various strategies that Trump is employing to stay in power. And then he was asked, oh, does that mean you will not accept the results of the election? He said, no. He had to walk this back. He said, we will accept whatever the outcome is. We just saying that people have to go and vote. In other words, there's not going to be any effort of social mobilization, of an attempt to organize broad-based opposition to the Trump administration. And that is what they have been doing for the past 4 years and beyond, actually. It would be worth, since 2000 came up, I was just reading before this meeting, the concession speech of Al Gore in 2000, because that was really what decided the election. The Supreme Court voted 5-4 to hand the election to George W. Bush, a blatantly undemocratic, unconstitutional decision in which Justice Scalia argued that the population does not have the right to vote in the United States. After that decision, Al Gore got up and said, I concede in the interests of, he said, national unity, in the interests of democracy, he said, I concede the election to George W. Bush and will do everything I can to make sure that the incoming administration is as successful as possible. They said, no one internationally should take this as a sign of American weakness, et cetera. That was the response. And we wrote at the time that the decision by Gore to concede demonstrated, and the absence of within the Democratic Party, the media, of any opposition to this electoral coup to install Bush into power, that the absence of opposition demonstrated that there was no significant constituency for democratic rights in the United States, in the ruling class in the United States. 20 years later, I mean, that analysis has been confirmed in spades. I mean, the whole trajectory of American capitalism, growing inequality, endless war, has not only vomited up Donald Trump, but it also has, ever more openly exposed the fact that American, as we write in one of our recent statements, American democracy is at death's door. There is not within the ruling elites a constituency for democratic rights. So these questions, I think, really, it's critical. The reason I'm raising this again in relationship to the question, I think it's critical, first of all, that workers and young people really sort of understand these basic political issues. And that's the foundation to counter all the inevitable pressures. Well, you have to support the Democratic Party. Look how terrible Trump is. It's necessary to support the Democratic Party, rather than what is actually necessary, the building of a political movement in the working class based upon a socialist program. And all those who are arguing this, including Sanders, are merely in their own way participating in a political operation which is smothering the development of a mass movement against Trump as a personification of the naked ruthlessness and criminality of the American ruling class as a whole. And so that's, I think that's the critical issue. How do you oppose this? Build a socialist movement, build a socialist leadership in the working class, go out to workers, explain what's happening, develop the readership of the World Socialist website, build this political leadership, because that's the foundation upon which a real fight against this can be waged.
Thank you very much, Joseph. I would just like to remind people that you can submit questions, and we encourage everyone to do so on slido.com, slido.com, and just enter the code in there to find at this meeting, which is the code is Socialism 2020, and then you can type your questions in there. I think, yes, there was the other question, which I don't think you got to there, Joseph, about whether Black Lives Matter represents a way forward. And perhaps another panelist would like to discuss that, or or perhaps you'd like to respond to that,
Well,
Joseph, because there have been, there have been these major protests in the United States over police violence and racism, and in fact internationally there have been protests, you know, in solidarity against the murder of George Floyd, and undoubtedly, you know, that's a real, you know, definitely shows the mass opposition that exists, not only to the police but to the Trump administration. Anyway, sorry, I'll let you comment on that.
Yeah,
Joseph.
no, yeah, sorry, I neglected to answer that element of it. And of course, in terms of the demonstration, including in New Zealand, where there were some of the largest international protests against police violence, and that actually demonstrated the global character of it, and the multiracial, multi-ethnic character in the United States of those protests demonstrated really fundamentally that these are not racial, fundamentally racial questions, that these were class issues. I mean, if you consider Trump's conspiracy, it's very clear. I mean, you know, what is police violence connected to? It is connected to the conspiracies of the ruling elites, the efforts to suppress opposition to growing social inequality. Certainly, Trump sees the police as a significant base for his operations, and so the fight against police violence is the fight against the capitalist state. It's a fight against the whole policy of the ruling class in response to the pandemic. It's a fight against social inequality, and the role of the Democratic Party and affiliated organizations, including the Black Lives Matter organization, was to try to present this entirely in racial terms, to argue that the basic conflict is between white America and Black America, or that, you know, once more, Trump is the personification not of the rule of the financial oligarchy, but the rule of white America and of white supremacy. And that is to turn these questions into, not to ignore, to subvert, to suppress the class issues in favor of elevating racial conflict. And that is a central strategy of the Democratic Party, entirely in line with its strategy of downplaying, ignoring, covering up the character of what the Trump administration is really doing, entirely in line with its efforts to divert opposition behind its own right-wing campaign against Russia, against, you know, representing sections of the military intelligence apparatus. You know, it's an effort to prevent and block the development of a class movement. And, you know, the sentiment which found broad-based expression in the protests of hostility to police violence and also hostility to racism has to be connected to the development of a class movement, an understanding that the issues are fundamentally class questions. It can't be, we say in a recent statement, it can't be quarantined. The opposition to police violence can't be quarantined from the broader class issues, the fight against the pandemic, unemployment, poverty, all the basic issues confronting workers of all races and all nationalities. This is a class movement. It's an international a class movement. So I think that, you know, clarifying that issue is really fundamental in the development of a movement against the Trump administration.
Yeah, if I could also add to that, you know, there were recent reports that have come out about sort of the economic situation and really the vast amount of wealth that has been hoarded, even more so into the, you know, particularly the top 1% of society. You know, which owns, you know, the vast majority. I think that the recent revelations show that 50 Americans own as much wealth as 165 million, the bottom 50%. So on, you know, one pole of society, and this is, you know, what we're saying, on one pole of society, you have a ruling and financial elite that has benefited from the pandemic, has enriched itself via the CARES Act, the bipartisan approved CARES Act, handing over, some $3 trillion to itself, but life for the masses has only gotten worse. Just in the US alone, some 50 million people are facing hunger. This is in the wealthiest country in the world. We have 30 million people on unemployment who are being thrown off of the additional benefits. When it comes to all questions of austerity, cuts to social services, unemployment, the Democrats and the Republicans fundamentally agree. And when this vast divide between a financial elite, the bourgeoisie, and the working class is so stark that, within such a system, democracy is entirely incompatible with that vast, divide. And so, this, what life is like for the masses who are facing unemployment, hunger, being forced back into these, schools, so that children be forced back into the classroom so that their parents can be forced to continue bringing in the profits to pay for the debt that was incurred on society when it was hoarded and handed over to the corporate and financial elite. So, what we're really saying is that, what is the major divide in society? It is a class divide. And it's actually the Democratic Party more than any other who promotes these concepts that race and identity, are the fundamental divisions in society. And such an ideology is actually able to promote this right-wing figure such as Harris, who, has argued the necessity for, longer prison sentences, the need for, cheap prison labor to fight California wildfires, criminal law and order policies. It's under that ideology that such a figure, can be promoted as any way progressive.
Thank you, Nerissa. I'd like to go back a bit to talk more about the coup attempt or the coup plan in Michigan. And perhaps this is something that Eric could speak about, because we have got a couple of questions coming in, which I think pertain to this. One person asks, where is Trump getting the idea to do all of this? Who's advising him? And secondly, what are the financial backers for these plots? What's the financial backers for Trump? There has to be big money behind him. I wonder if you could perhaps talk about that as much as we can.
Yes, well, what this shows is also the completely criminal character of the lack of investigation in the bourgeois press, in the corporate media. Because the fact is that, if this were a police lineup, the number of potential culprits, would be vast, because the Trump administration, with basically the collaboration of the Democratic Party, has brought the fringes of what once were known as far-right extreme politics right into the White House. Just so if we want to go through some of the people, and again, these are the questions, the unanswered questions. We don't have a crystal ball, but these are there are a number of connections which should, including about individuals and organizations, which should be investigated. Just if you start locally in Michigan, there's the Republican majority leader of the state Senate, Mike Shirkey, who is alleged by the Democratic lieutenant governor to have personally met and spoken with the individuals the far-right militiamen who came into the state legislature in April and brought their assault rifles into the gallery of the legislative building. Mike Shirkey also held a rally at the end of this week, attended a rally of right-wing people at the Michigan State Capitol after the charges were announced, at which he said to those who were there who were right-wing, what could only be taken as encouragement. He said, "This is no time to be weak in our commitment to freedom. We need to be strong and not be afraid of those who are taking our freedoms away from us." You have also the sheriff of Berry County, Michigan, a man named Dar Leaf, who was photographed speaking at an anti-lockdown rally earlier this summer with two of the fascists who were arrested by the feds earlier this week. And when he was asked, the sheriff, about the arrests, he said, well, I haven't read everything about it, but we can't convict them in the media. Again, I mean, all of these are deliberate signals of approval.
You said that they were perhaps carrying out a citizen's arrest.
Yeah, implying that she herself Gretchen Whitmer was a criminal for the lockdown measures. Now, okay, those are just a couple of them. But if you, Leaf, for example, is a regular, he's been invited on Fox News on a number of occasions. He's a member of what's called the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, the CSPOA, which was founded by Joe Arpaio. Most listeners probably have heard of him. For those, especially internationally, this is a former sheriff of Maricopa County in Arizona, who is a proud Trump supporter. He was actually convicted for perjury, I believe. I think that's correct. And Trump pardoned him in 2017. Arpaio was setting up tent camps for prisoners in the Arizona heat. He is a fascistic individual. Leaf, by the way, was named the Sheriff of the Year in 2016 by the CSPOA. Their theory is basically, there's hundreds of them who are in this organization. Their theory is that the sheriff is essentially a dictator in his county. He can do whatever he wants. Another recipient of this award was David Clark, the former sheriff of Milwaukee County, who was a lead surrogate in the Trump campaign in 2016. He won the CSPOA Sheriff of the Year award in 2013. But if one really begins to look then at who in the Trump administration is potentially involved in this and where questions have to be asked, again, it's any number of current and former advisors. There's obviously the fascist Stephen Miller, who's the architect of Trump's anti-immigrant crackdown, who, by the way, has just announced, that is, Trump's immigration officials have just announced that they're now going to be arresting immigrants who can't prove that they've been in the United States for 2 years without even going to immigration court, immediately, deported on the spot effectively. This is going to be taking place in Democratic cities in the weeks before the election. I don't want to go on and on, but there's Roger Stone, who Trump also pardoned. Stone was pardoned in July. He's been actively cultivating very close ties with the Proud Boys. He's actually hired them as his personal bodyguards. And he's also in recent weeks been speaking on fascist conspiracy programs like the Alex Jones Show and some YouTube channel of the QAnon conspiracy. Both of these are fascistic conspiracy theories with anti-Semitic undertones or overtones, as the case may be. And Stone is cultivating them, promoting them, helping the Trump campaign by mobilizing in these very dark circles. There's also Michael Caputo, who encouraged Trump's former, I think he was in the health, some undersecretary of something or other in Health and Human Services. But
he became the lead official overseeing the Trump's response to the coronavirus pandemic in the Health and Human Services Department.
Yeah, well, that just goes to show. But and he was encouraging people to join a New York militia, the New York Watchmen. Keep in mind that the organization in Michigan was called the Wolverine Watchmen. And just in terms of the question of money, Yes, I mean, there's any number of, oh, well, I forgot to mention Eric Prince, the Blackwater associate, who's the brother of Betsy DeVos, who's the education secretary. Prince was hunting with Eric Trump and Donald Jr. When he was proposing that Trump establish a private mercenary CIA type organization. I mean, these are the types of people who are running the US government. And advising the president. I mean, the question is an important one. Who's giving him these ideas? But it's not just who's giving him these ideas. It's that these are the policies of the administration. And again, just in terms of the financial support, a number of names have come up which are important. Again, these are questions which should be asked. There's Michonne Maddock, who's the founder of the Michigan Conservative Coalition. Her husband is a state representative, a Republican in Michigan. She's on Trump's campaign advisory board and is a prominent figure in the Women for Trump campaign, also regularly appeared on Fox News. The Michigan Conservative Coalition is one of the organizations which funded the anti-lockdown protests earlier this year. And that's important because many of these people who were arrested either met and conspired at these events or attended them as participants. There's also Greg McNeely. He's the head of the Michigan Freedom Fund, which also is funding the anti-lockdown protests. He is a longtime political advisor of the DeVos family. And then, of course, there's the Mercer family, the funders of Breitbart News, and supporters of Stephen Bannon, who was also just arrested earlier this year. The Mercers are, of course, also interestingly, Eric Prince's wife, Stacey, is apparently very close to the Mercer family. But anyway, these are the sort of types which are around. And one can, you know, if the investigative journalists in the bourgeois press who had the resources were really looking, there would be an immense amount of information coming out every day, every hour about this plot and this conspiracy. And you know, the last thing I'll say before handing it back over is, you know, if you think about the amount of time that was spent in the Watergate crisis over investigating the crimes that were carried out by Nixon's aides, who were stealing the campaign plans of his Democratic opponent. I mean, there were weeks and weeks and months of hearings. Every day, the population would turn on the news to listen to senators grilling Alderman and Ehrlichman and all of these figures in the Trump administration. And there's nothing today. And the plot, again, I mean, it's important to just remind people, this was a very far advanced plot by people who, by the way, we now know have all sorts of connections to national fascist organizations and militias, to kidnap a sitting governor, take her across state lines, put her on trial, and murder her. And within just a few days, it's effectively completely disappeared or almost completely disappeared from the press. No investigation into this whatsoever. And that is something which should be a very serious warning sign to the people who are listening, and especially to the workers who are listening to this call. Because the question of investigating and exposing this plot and protecting the population against it is going to be decided by, as Joe said, the extent to which the working class is capable of organizing itself in the neighborhoods, in the schools, in the factories, and on that basis, preparing for the largest possible mobilization to prevent the possibility that Trump will attempt to conduct these operations on Election Day or shortly thereafter.
Well, thank you, Eric. Sorry.
No, if I could also just quickly add to that. I mean, Eric mentioned the Michigan Freedom Fund, which was one of the sponsors of the April anti-lockdown protests in Lansing. And just, I wanted to point out that the SEP was denied. We fought a legal battle in the state of Michigan and California as well to get onto the ballot. We have been raising the alarm about the threat of dictatorship, the threat of fascism, asking many of these questions. And we are leading this analysis and trying to raise the alarm. And I think it really speaks to our perspective, especially when you compare it to what the role of the Democrats has been. So on the one hand, they're completely spineless when it comes to fighting the Trump administration, but when it comes to actually putting socialist candidates on the ballot in Michigan, we tried to basically ask for any way that we could get on the ballot that did not put our signature gatherers and our supporters at risk to gather the 12,000 signatures that are required. And actually, Whitmer herself, the state argued against us and actually said that we should be out during the middle of a pandemic collecting these signatures, and actually pointed to those anti-lockdown protests in Lansing as an example of this is what practicing your democratic rights, your constitutional rights looks like. So when it comes, basically this anti-lockdown protests, these right-wing protesters who would later be many of the same individuals that would attempt to carry out this kidnapping were defended at the time as an example of what, using your constitutional rights look like. But the Democrats have fought tooth and nail to keep the SEP the only party that has been raising the alarm completely off the ballot, and thereby really preventing the working class from having any representation.
If I could
Thanks.
just add a
Yes.
quick point in relationship to the protests in May, which of course were financed by DeVos, Trump's education secretary, and as Eric said, the brother of Eric Prince. Those were presented in the media as well as some sort of popular expression of hostility to the measures which had been implemented to stop the spread of the coronavirus. And it wasn't just the right-wing media. It was presented because this was a bipartisan policy. This was after the implementation of the CARES Act, the bailout of Wall Street. The ruling class turned towards forcing workers back to work, including auto workers in Michigan who had rebelled in late March against the ongoing work regime under unsafe conditions, and had organized walkouts outside of the control of the UAW, wildcat strikes and walkouts, to force the shutdown of production as the pandemic was spreading. And then the ruling class is that it passed the CARES Act, and they sought to then implement the Back to Work campaign. And these rallies were sort of utilized as part of sort of a public relations effort, and they were sort of legitimized. You had outright fascists who were sort of mobilizing in the state capitol armed, and it was sort of presented in the media as some sort of legitimate expression of popular sentiment. And they were all moving towards ending the restrictions, including here in Michigan, where where Whitmer oversaw the reopening of the auto plants very, very quickly, and which still now are still opened under conditions of the expanding pandemic. But what I think it really underscores is that the whole campaign, the sort of right-wing fascistic movement, which has been deliberately incited and promoted, is intimately connected with the ruling class policy in relationship to the pandemic to force workers back on the job and to enforce a homicidal policy that has led to massive death and is producing enormous opposition. And I think that's also helps explain the response of the Democratic Party, because they have, whatever their sort of tactical differences with Trump on issues, particularly foreign policy, they have implemented this policy. They have supported the back to work, and they offer no alternative to the policy that the Trump administration is implementing in relationship to the pandemic.
I think we've got an interesting question which may be on a lot of people's minds, and it says this may have already been addressed in part anyway, but what do we say to people who deny that Trump is actually intending to carry out a fascist coup? And I thought, this was an important question because, as we've been discussing, the Democrats, the New York Times, the Washington Post, practically the entire media is doing its best to downplay what's happening. And on the other hand, the World Socialist website has been very forthright in really calling this as it is, that Trump is attempting to build a fascist personalist movement, and that he is very much intending and making that very public to carry out a coup. And there is, I thought this might be a good moment to introduce one of the, very striking pieces of evidence, if you like, for that, which is the very conscious sort of use of fascist symbolism by Trump and his, his advisors. And this has been a widely shared video that we produced on the World Socialist website, which, shows very clearly, I think, that, Trump has appropriated, I guess, Nazi symbolism in his political campaign. And so I wonder if we could show that brief video. Thanks. So I guess, anyone can comment on this if they would like to. I guess I would just, make the point again. The question we had was, what do we say to workers who tell us that, Trump is just a loose cannon, he's sick with the coronavirus, he's clearly mentally unstable, you can't take seriously that he's actually going to carry out a fascist coup. I mean, how do we, as socialists, respond to those questions?
So Joe, go ahead.
Well, I just make perhaps an initial point. First of all, thanks to Zach, who put together that very revealing video documenting. It's quite clear, that this was consciously modeled off of the propaganda film by Leni Riefenstahl from 1934. I think, well, there's a number of different aspects to this. I mean, I think one is, I think a gap between the state of the objective situation and the consciousness of broad masses of the population as to what is happening. I think that there is broad hostility to Trump, opposition, and a sense that this is an extremely dangerous figure. But I think that, there still is a real perhaps lack of understanding as to the extraordinary crisis and state to which we have come. And that is, I think, connected to the other element, which is obviously we've been speaking about the role of the Democratic Party in seeking to cover up what's happening, precisely because they're worried that if there's an understanding of what is happening, that it will spark mass opposition. This is not a popular policy. That's obviously the role of the Democratic Party. I would just also add, and perhaps others may speak on it a bit more, but the various organizations in and around the Democratic Party play the same role. The DSA, Jacobin magazine. Jacobin has not, as far as I could tell, I looked at their website before the meeting. They have not published a single article on the developments in Michigan. Their line basically is there's no real crisis in the United States, which corresponds on the one hand to the position that, you know, the Trump administration is in fact not a serious danger. And on the other hand, that there is no possibility for socialist revolution in the United States, which they are absolutely opposed to. But I think just the final point I would make in relationship to this is that, I mean, the question also raises very complex historical issues. You know, what are the similarities and what are also the differences between the United States in 2020 and Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, or Italy in the 1920s, when you had the emergence of Hitler and Mussolini. I would say that the one point that I would stress is that the population as a whole, the workers and youth, are moving to the left. There is an enormous political radicalization among in the working class. The general political movement is not to the right, but is to the left. The Trump administration is itself in extreme crisis. It's relying, obviously, it's seeking to mobilize and create a fascist movement. It is very much relying on elements within the state apparatus, particularly within the police, within the Department of Homeland Security, within sections of the military. The Democrats themselves are oriented to dominant sections within the military as well. But the population as a whole, workers and young people, are moving to the left. The critical question and the critical or what really has to be done in response to this danger is to make that political movement conscious, to turn that into a conscious political movement for socialism. And I think that's the key issue, and the threat which arises from the real breakdown of democracy and the real danger of dictatorship in the United States. The basic issue is resolving that fundamental question of political consciousness and leadership. Some initial points, but Eric, you wanted to speak on it?
Well, no, I think those were along the lines of what I was going to say. I would just add, though, it's the most. We of course don't know exactly what's going to happen on election day. There are a lot of different factors involved in this. I also think that there's several thousand fascist militias out there, but they haven't showed their face in South Bronx or in East LA or in the South Side of Chicago. There is a very large and powerful working class in this country and obviously around the world, which has to be, as Joe says, made aware of the basis upon which to fight this. But I do think also there's another example. Counterpunch ran an article the day after the announcement of charges, which is almost at a loss for words about how much they're trying to downplay the dangers that are present in the current situation. I mean, these are some of the quotes from this article in Counterpunch. Quote, "There is no fascist threat in the United States." Another quote, "Unlike Hitler, Trump uses subterfuge rather than violence to achieve his goals." The article says, "There is not the slightest sign that American workers are thinking in class terms, let alone radicalizing." And then also, Trotsky, quote, "Trotsky's class analysis hardly corresponds to our situation today. American society is stable." Now you read these lines, and I think this is an important distinction for all those who are listening, who consider themselves left. You maybe read the World Socialist website, you may be on this call because you're interested in the election campaign that Joe Kishore and Santa Cruz are engaged in. But if you want to know the fundamental distinction between revolutionary politics and what we refer to as the pseudo-left, that is, you read these lines, the complacency, the perspective of which derives fundamentally from an very affluent class position, that don't worry too much, don't rock the boat, everything's going to be fine, get behind either Biden or the Greens or something. That's the perspective of the pseudo-left. And as Joe's outlining, our perspective is fundamentally different. The working class is objectively a socially revolutionary force, not just in America. I think one of the extreme limitations of the quotes that I just read from this Counterpunch article is that there's not the slightest sign that American workers are thinking in class terms, let alone radicalizing. Well, okay, set aside first the fact that a self-described socialist, Bernie Sanders, won 13 million votes in 2016, and that there's been a strike movement in this country in the last year. But just the perspective of nationalism, which is evinced here, that it all depends on the American workers. Well, that's not the perspective of revolutionary socialists. And maybe this is something actually that Tom could speak on a bit more as well, because 2019 saw the largest mass movement of demonstrations in world history, actually. And it's sort of easy to forget it because we've all been quarantined over the last several months, but going back to work under these conditions. But in countries like Chile, Sudan, France, in Colombia, you can Haiti. You can only begin to list all the countries which saw the largest outbreak of social opposition to attacks on living standards and to dictatorship. And under these conditions, the attitude of the American radicals is well, the situation's not that bad, and plus, you don't really want to fight for socialism because that'll only encourage the fascists. That's the path to defeat. And we're taking a fundamentally different approach. We're taking a Marxist approach to the fight to build a leadership. And as Joe says, really to explain the historical questions, to explain the need for revolutionary leadership, and in that way, transform the working class into a class which is self-aware of its revolutionary historical tasks. But I guess to transition, Tom, what do you think about, on the one hand, how is this being viewed in the United States internationally? And on the other hand, what are the implications for the global working class about watching the collapse of any remnants of bourgeois democratic forms in this, the capital, the lion's den of world imperialist reaction?
Well, I think, it has an extraordinary international significance, and that's why the response of world leaders has been, I think, very nervous and very muted. They are trying to, like the Democratic Party and many of the groups that you've mentioned, are trying to basically downplay the very real threat of dictatorship and the extreme right in America. We reported, or the World Socialist website reported, about the response in Canada, for example, just the other day, where Justin Trudeau has said, he was asked about for his reaction to some of Donald Trump's statements, and he said, we're certainly all hoping for a smooth transition or a clear result from the election, like many people around the world. If it is less clear, there may be some disruptions and we need to be ready for any outcomes. That's what Canadians would expect of their government, and we're certainly reflecting on that, which of course is a very vaguely worded sort of response from the Canadian leader. I mean, what exactly does he mean when he says we're preparing for any outcomes? I mean, undoubtedly there are discussions going on in ruling circles all throughout the world over how they are going to respond in the event that Trump follows through on his threat and takes hold of power after the election. I guess, in other words, I mean, all of the major allies of the United States are preparing for these different outcomes, but they are seeking to conceal the real danger for their own populations, which, as you alluded to, Eric, there's an explosive situation internationally, and if the population is aware of the danger of dictatorship in the United States, supposedly the center of world democracy, although I'm not sure how many people actually believe that anymore. But nevertheless, a country with a long democratic tradition, going back to the American Revolution, which still undoubtedly, has a definite, I guess, weight in people's political consciousness. So the breakdown of democracy in the United States is a major question, and governments throughout the world do not want their own populations to, be politically attuned to the dangers that exist, because these dangers are international. It's not just the United States where the far right has been systematically promoted over recent years in direct response to the growth in the class struggle. You have in Germany the Alternative for Germany, which is a fascist party or an extreme right-wing party that downplays or seeks to rehabilitate Nazism. Well, they are now in parliament, and they are treated as a legitimate, a legitimate force in the establishment politics of Germany. Similar forces exist in France, all throughout Europe, and internationally. Just in this part of the world, I mean, in New Zealand, which is sometimes portrayed as exceptional, because listeners may be aware that our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has been glorified for her response to the pandemic, also last year for her response to the Christchurch massacre by a far-right terrorist who had been inspired by Donald Trump. But I think all of the same dangers of the extreme right exist here as well, and this country is in no way separate. We are approaching an election on Saturday, in fact, and there has been virtually no discussion by either of the major parties about the crisis that's unfolding in the United States. There was one debate here between Prime Minister Ardern and her opponent, Judith Collins, in which they were both asked, do you think Donald Trump is a dangerous influence in the world? And they both managed to dodge the question. And Ardern answered just by saying, if a democracy delivers Donald Trump, then that's who we will work with. Which, I mean, this was just hours after the presidential debate in the United States, in which Trump railed against the mail-in voting ballots and made very clear again that he's not going to give up power just because he's voted out, and told his fascist supporters to stand by. I mean, none of that is being discussed here. None of it in the United States, in Australia, in Europe, all of that is being suppressed. But I think this has to be taken as a very clear warning that these governments, these allies of the United States internationally, will, should Trump come to power as he's threatening to do, they will support him. But I think the points Eric made, I mean, just to reiterate that, what we're discussing today is, of course, the immense danger of fascism, but also the revolutionary situation that we're in. and the enormous potential for building a worldwide socialist movement. I mean, the countries Eric has mentioned, last year, which were engulfed in class struggles. I mean, that was very nervously described as a leaderless revolution, which is in a comment by the CSIS, an influential think tank in Washington. I mean, these people, as they pointed out, are being driven all over the world by essentially the same question: social inequality. So in contrast to the analysis of, or if you want to use that word, of the pseudo left, who insist on downplaying, insisting that everything is stable in the United States, the reality is very different. And I think what this points to really is the urgency for those listening, wherever you are in the world, to contact the International Committee of the Fourth International. And, now is the time for you to become involved as a socialist, politically active. It's not a time for sitting on the sidelines and watching the events unfold. I mean, how this situation, how this crisis develops is an open question. It's not decided, and the crucial factor is how will the working class respond? So I just wanted to make that point, really.
Well, we should remind our viewers and listeners that they're listening to a campaign rally held by the Socialist Equality Party and the International Committee, Fourth International. We're here with Joseph Kishore, U.S. presidential candidate of the SEP, as well as Nerissa Santa Cruz, the vice presidential candidate. I'm Eric London, World Socialist website reporter, and Tom Peters is moderating with me from the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. This question's for Joe and or Nerissa, but to introduce it, I just want to reference briefly just a couple of excerpts from Trotsky's really critical analysis of the, in Whither, France, of the emerging threat posed by the extreme right in the middle 1930s. And I think there, just as by way of a brief introduction, there was a party of the French middle class known as the Radical Party. This is a party which, compared to the Democratic Party, the comparison does not really work, because the Democratic Party is a party of the big bourgeoisie in the United States. But Trotsky makes some points about the Radical Party and about those left radicals who one might draw a certain comparison to Sanders with. Again, every analogy limps. But Trotsky writes that, like the camel under its driver's whip, radicalism gets down on its four knees to let capitalist reaction sit between its humps. Without the political support of the radicals, the Dumarge, that is the far-right government, would at the present moment be impossible. And then he makes another point, and and this is the question I'm going to ask Joe and Nerissa. I'll cheat and help you. Is why should they vote for you and not Joe Biden, the big candidate? You obviously have been excluded from the ballot in most states, and we can be honest with ourselves and say, if the polls are any indication, that we might not win the election on November 3rd. But anyway, the second quote that I just wanted to read is so fantastic. And Trotsky, again, writing about the radicals in France, the Radical Party. But he says, only that party has the right to historical existence, which believes in its own program and strives to rally the whole people to its banner. Otherwise, it is not a party, but a parliamentary coterie, a clique of careerists. It is not only the right, but the elementary duty of the proletarian party to free the toiling masses from the fatal influence of the bourgeoisie. This historic task takes on a particular sharpness at the present time, for the radicals are more than ever striving to cover up the reaction, to lull and dupe the people, and in this way prepare for the victory of fascism. And the left radicals, they capitulate to Herriot, just as Herriot capitulates to Tardieu. And one might make a similar point. What about Sanders? What about Ocasio-Cortez? They capitulate to Biden like Biden capitulates to Trump. But I guess the question then is, what is it, what is the actual action that people are taking if they vote for you? And why is it that these historical questions, the comparison to the events which Trotsky's writing about in Wither, France, are experiences which have to be understood by workers and young people today?
Marisa, would you like to speak on that? You want me to answer?
Sure, I'll begin. I mean, first I'll say that in the kind of refusal and denial of the SCP off of the ballot in most states, what that amounts to is that there is no political representation for the working class and youth. Both of the parties of Wall Street, are carrying out these very, dangerous and deadly back to work campaigns. They agree on every aspect of austerity, on deportations, on really doing nothing to prevent the spread of COVID, and their real differences are really just amongst foreign policy and sort of who to go to war with, whether China or Russia. And the SEP, I think kind of in relation to what Eric was reading, I mean, we are a party and a movement, an international movement that relies and bases itself on studying the lessons of history. So when we analyze many people sort of ask, well, how is it that you were able to know that Sanders would betray the aspirations of a lot of particularly young people who want socialism? How is it that you are able to, in this meeting, for instance, analyze the forces that are at play, what's happening, while the Democrats close their eyes to it? How is it that we're able to make this analysis? And that is because we analyze the historical and political background of all parties and organizations based on what their platform is, their program, and their history. So we have a very, long and proud history, one that, goes all the way back to, the fight against Stalinism. Actually, the fight against the Fourth International was built in the aftermath of the defeats of the working class in Germany and against the fight against fascism. So, we have a long political history that allows us the ability to analyze events, to make an analysis, and really represent the working class. That's why our position has been, one of warning of the threat of the coup, laying out all of Trump's fascistic policies, and also fundamentally analyzing, the role of the Democrats, these two factions within the bourgeoisie. So a vote for the Socialist Equality Party is a vote for, the aspirations of the working class who want, not just an end to capitalism, an end to war, fighting the COVID pandemic with the highest degree of science, the closure of non-essential businesses. I mean, all of these things are sort of bound up with a political program and perspective that is not at all available from either parties, the Democrats or the Republicans. So a vote for us means of vote that represents the interests and aspirations of the working class internationally.
Thanks, Narissa. Just another question which came in earlier was, and perhaps this has been partially addressed already, but what do you say to younger people or to workers who may have been involved in the protests against police killings and who are somewhat, attracted to the perspective of identity politics, that this, that this is a question of primarily of race and not class. I wonder if either Joe or Narissa could perhaps address that, and specifically our analysis of that on the site and how it really is playing into the hands of the right wing and Donald Trump.
Well, that's a complicated question. First of all, I think the simple answer is that those who are opposed to police violence have to take up the fight for socialism and recognize that when one's talking about the police and the horrific repression and violence which is meted out every day, these are class questions. And while racism plays a role, and obviously as we've seen, the most backward elements are recruited into the police in promotion of fascistic conceptions, that that what is driving it is class. That police violence affects workers of all races. I think that, and these are fundamentally class questions. I think with everything, one also has to understand the issue of identity politics historically, and so how it really came to be promoted as somehow associated with left politics, and it's not. Identity politics was developed and promoted as a conscious response in opposition to Marxism and to class politics. And this, one can trace its pedigree, I would say, in particular, to the 1960s and 70s, the response to the social upheavals of that period, including the civil rights movement, the uprisings in cities. There was a move by a powerful section of the ruling class. It was actually introduced by Nixon and then became the basic framework of Democratic Party politics. But it was initiated within layers of what we call the pseudo left, who sought to really very consciously substitute class politics for racial politics or gender politics or politics based on any category except for class, and to undermine the significance of class, and really to deny it. And that became the politics of the Democratic Party. And it became sort of the mechanism for elevating a very small layer of the upper middle class into positions of power, within the state, within corporate boardrooms, within the trade unions, not fighting for genuine equality, but for fighting for the allocation of inequality by race or gender. And it's a politics of the upper middle class. It's a politics of the ruling elite. And so the fight against police violence, and also the fight against racism and all forms of backwardness, is a fight to unify the working class on the foundation of its basic class interests. And so that's really, but these questions really have to be understood, and a real study of Marxism and the history of Marxism carried out. I mean, young people who are entering into politics, I mean, there's enormous political radicalization. There's a desire for change. There's a hostility, obviously, to Trump. There's a hostility to social inequality. We've seen the eruption of protests which express the social anger. But young people really have are required to, or have to take up a serious study of politics, a serious study of history, and study the history of the socialist movement. I think that is a big challenge for young people who are entering into politics today.
Thank you, Joe. I have one more question, but before I ask the question, I'm going to ask for financial contributions from those who are listening. And this is an absolutely critical ask. We have expended a very substantial amount of resources in the course of this presidential campaign. We are, as our readers and listeners and viewers know, up against extremely powerful political enemies who control the apparatus of the state, of the corporations, of the media. The bourgeoisie, as we know, has its own strategists, its own universities, its own think tanks. The working class has the International Committee, the Fourth International, and we need resources. If you agree with this perspective, you should go right now to socialism2020.org/donate and make the largest contribution that you can make right now. This is, we hope, for those who agree with us, we hope that to the extent that you agree with us, you turn that agreement into real physical support by going online right now to socialism2020.org/donate and making a contribution. If you've given, if you've given $50 in the past, give us $250. If you've given us $100 in the past, give us $500 or $1,000. If you've given us $10 in the past, give us $100. We are at the very end of a long presidential campaign. We've been engaged in court battles at the 6th Circuit, the 9th Circuit, the Supreme Court. We have held meetings when we could across the country. And we've been engaged in a very serious effort to use social media and the technologies available to us to bring our perspective to the largest possible audience of workers and young people across the country. And we have been very successful. But we need the financial resources from our supporters. This is a very serious question. We ask, please now or right when this meeting is over, open up a new tab and make a donation. We need it. We're asking you for it. If you agree with us, give us money so that we can continue to build this party and to continue to fight for this perspective. We should just add as an aside that you do have to be a US citizen or permanent resident to donate to the presidential campaign. But last question I have is the World Socialist website recently underwent a very substantial relaunch. Those who are longtime readers will obviously know the difference. We don't have to get into extreme details about the organization of articles and that type of thing. But let me just ask the candidates or one of you or both of you, however you want, this will be my last question. What is the decision by the International Committee to relaunch the World Socialist website have to do with the extremely advanced character of the present political crisis? And what's the impact of that in your views on whether people should make the decision to join? That's obviously a bit of a loaded question, but it's a serious one, to join the Socialist Equality Party in whatever country they live in.
Well, I think the World Socialist website, the relaunch of the World Socialist website is a major event in the history of the socialist movement, the working class movement, the Trotskyist movement. I hope that all of those listening, if you're not currently readers of the World Socialist website, that you go to it. It is the essential resource for workers around the world for a daily analysis of political developments and for a explanation of the historical and theoretical issues that arise from these developments. As Eric's noted, the International Committee, which publishes the World Socialist website, relaunched the website. It's in new design, modern technology. The most critical element of it is a much more clear connection between what we're writing every day and the immense archive of our movement and its analysis of the evolution of world politics. If you take, for example, and that's the essential foundation upon which one has to understand anything. If you go back to this question of, what do you say to a worker who doesn't think that Trump is organizing a fascist coup, for example, or is underestimating the danger which exists? Well, in order to answer that question, again, one always has to go back to the historical development, to place the present political situation within its historical context, within its immediate context. And here you can trace how the Trump administration has developed its strategy, beginning particularly with the speech in early June, where he threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act and deploy the military, through the deployment of federal police in Portland to snatch and grab protesters, through the praise of Rittenhouse and the murder of the protester in Washington, Reinhold, through the Republican National Convention. And you can trace the strategy. It's very clear what Trump is doing. But then placing it in a broader historical context, the evolution of the Trump administration, what it comes out of, what the analysis that we made in 2000, the significance, which you've been speaking about, the evolution of American capitalism since then, the incredible growth of social inequality, of course, now intersecting with the pandemic. And that's then expressed in politics. Trump is himself a personification of that. Because, of course, the other argument is, well, Trump is a great danger, but if we just were able to get rid of Trump, it would all pass away. And there, of course, that leads to the argument, well, you should just support for Biden. And if we can just get rid of Trump, well, things may go back to normal. And that's not going to happen. Whatever happens in November 3rd, and we can't say precisely what will happen, but the basic tendencies of which Trump is an expression are going to continue in one form or another. If the Democrats end up in office, they will adapt to the far right. They will make all sorts of concessions. The development of a fascistic movement has been initiated. That will continue, whatever happens. And of course, if Trump retains power, he will see that as a green light for a massive intensification of political repression. So I think the point in relationship to the website is that, when we talk about the development of a socialist movement and a consciousness, a socialist consciousness, a socialist leadership, what is that? It's not just a question of, this or that, tactical demand. It comes out of a real understanding of the totality of capitalist society, an understanding of the world situation, the ability to apply the experiences in the world politics to what is happening in the United States. We just published on the World Socialist website this week a critical perspective which reviews the experiences in Germany and the fact that the German state has cultivated and promoted far-right anti-Semitic fascistic organizations within the military, within the police. Tom referred to the AfD earlier. But to be able to apply the experiences of the world situation, to be able to apply the experiences of history to an understanding of what is happening. That is the essential foundation for a real political consciousness. You can't really orient yourself in a very rapidly changing political situation without that grounding, without an international perspective, and without a historical knowledge and experience. And I think the World Socialist website is absolutely unique in that it embodies those conceptions. And it's absolutely unique because the International Committee of the Fourth International is the World Socialist movement. There is no other political movement that is fighting for this perspective. So, I hope that it's a complex question. I hope that answers it. I don't know if Nerissa would like to add anything, but I would certainly urge everyone to read the website, review the redesign, go to some of the pages. I don't know if all of our regular readers have had the chance to explore, or we have it on the page, to explore some of the pages that we have put together. The Fourth International page, if you go to the Socialist Equality Party page, you can access all the previous documents of the SEP. The Fourth International page has it's an immense resource in the history of the Trotskyist movement. And you can just go from one tab to the next and explore what critical historical experiences, what the World Socialist website wrote on every major international political development. Zach is going through, but the resource, you click on more on the Russian Revolution and it brings up a page which has an immense wealth of material, including the lectures that we gave in 2017 on the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. So go through it, use it as a real repository of knowledge that is required to build a socialist movement today. It's an extraordinary resource which we're constantly seeking to develop. You go to the Global Class Struggle page. We have material on critical theoretical issues. What are the trade unions? Why are they hostile to socialism? Critical lecture by David North. Anyway, one could go on, but it is an immense resource, and it's an expression in our own activity, the response of the International Committee to this objective situation and the immense change that is taking place, not only in the United States, but internationally.
Thank you. Well, I think it may be time to wrap up, but on behalf of our listeners and of myself, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Joseph, Narissa, and also Eric. If you asked a question and we didn't have time to get to it, then I apologize for that. I think we got to most of them, but please do contact us. Keep in touch and continue this discussion and deepen your education as a Marxist and as a Trotskyist. Follow our analysis on the World Socialist website. This brilliant redesign that Joe was going through does express the most conscious response of the party of the international working class to the present breakdown of capitalism that we've been discussing today. And I would appeal again to everyone listening, now is the time to become politically active as a socialist. There will be mass revolutionary struggles in the United States and in every country. However, the Trotskyist movement insists, and all historical experience backs this up, that such struggles have to be armed with a conscious, thought out, independent revolutionary program and strategy, and that the critical task is to build that political leadership with the program that can unite these struggles internationally. There are only two historical alternatives before us in this situation. The ruling elite has its answer, which is world war and dictatorship. The response of the working class has to be to take the road of international socialism, the reorganization of the world on the basis of meeting human needs and abolishing the private profit system and the exploitation of humans by other humans. So please, if you're in the United States, vote for Joseph Kishore and Narissa Santa Cruz as president and vice president, but also join the Socialist Equality Party and support its campaign. And for those of you throughout the world, write in and apply to join the other sections of the International Committee of the Fourth International. If you're in a country where there is no section, then contact us and we will work with you to build this world party as the leadership of the working class in every country in the world. So thank you very much for your attention today. Goodbye.
Bye.